This is The Common Health from the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security, engaging senior leaders on questions of how to address our common health security challenges in this post-COVID moment. I'm thrilled today to be joined again by a really high-performing journalist and good friend here in Washington, D.C., Carmen Paun. Carmen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me again, Steve. It's always great to be here.
Carmen's the global health reporter based in Washington, D.C. for Politico. She's been in that post now for 5 years. She's covering a wide front of issues. We'll touch on a number of those. Prior to that, 5 years of duty in Brussels for Politico, covering the health beat in Europe, at also a really amazing time in terms of the big issues emerging in that context. She's Romanian. She's now an American citizen the last 2 years. She's Romanian. She trained at the University of Bucharest in the journalist program, and we're delighted to have her with us here today. I'm going to start, Carmen, with breaking news this morning. Today is Thursday, March 13th. Just a few minutes ago, the Trump White House announced that it was pulling the nomination of former Congressman David Weldon to be the head of CDC. Dr. Weldon was slated to appear today at the Senate Help Committee for confirmation hearings on becoming the new director of CDC, and then suddenly he gets pulled. Now, the background on this is there's been a lot of smoldering discussion and hesitation and doubt rumored around Washington about this nomination, but it was all a little murky about how serious was this, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we've had Makary Bhattacharya come forward, Makary for FDA, Bhattacharya for NIH. It was natural that we'd get Weldon come forward, Dr. Oz coming forward, I think tomorrow for CMS. Mm-hmm. So we've reached this moment where people are coming through the system, but there was doubt. There was doubt hanging over Weldon, and then he comes forward, and then they pull him back. Now, there hasn't been any clear explanation offered up to now, but let me put a couple of ideas forward and then just ask you to comment, aware that we're really not entirely sure what's happened here, but this is significant. This is a significant decision by the White House at the 11th hour. Now, I think what's happening here is a couple of things. One is the force of the measles outbreak in Texas and in New Mexico, which is escalating. It's a great concern to the state health commissioner and the governor of Texas, State Health Commissioner Jennifer Shuhold. It's a great concern within the White House. We now have in the Biodefense, Biosecurity, Global Health Security National Directorate and the Office of Pandemic Preparedness Response. We have Dr. Jerry Parker from Texas, so very knowledgeable there. We know we've seen in what's happening in Texas and New Mexico a growing fear that this is going to spread and ignite further outbreaks among unvaccinated, undervaccinated clusters and spread geographically. We've had, I think, 2, possibly 3 deaths recorded, which suggests that the numbers are grossly underreported. We have active opposition folks like this guy, Ben Edwards, who set up a facility in Seminole, Texas, that's reached 200 families with sick children, counseling them against vaccines, counseling them to take up cod liver oil, vitamin A, steroids, antibiotics, and some of the rhetoric of the Secretary Kennedy of HHS in his Fox interview, 35-minute interview on the 4th of March, his commentary posted 2 days prior to that, a backhanded endorsement of vaccines, but then undermined by saying, we really have grave doubts about the safety of these vaccines. We want to get CDC to do a new study, even though the connection between autism and MMR vaccines has been debunked over the years. Allegations that these alternatives are good substitutes for prevention and treatment, and an argument that if you acquire immunity from measles, somehow that will help you downstream, versus the actual reality is it can wipe out your immune protections against other things. So I think that what we're seeing here is a pivot point in the White House of enough is enough, that the fear that putting Weldon in place, he's too sympathetic to all of this, he's too aligned to all of these positions, that would be a bridge too far and raise the risk of serious damage to the Trump administration among the American public on these matters. We have not just the measles outbreak, we've got H5N1, we've got a flu season that is sending record numbers of people into the hospitals. We need leadership in CDC. Washington Post lead editorial this morning was pretty much along those lines of enough is enough. Tell me how you responded, what you see there, aware that we haven't had a full explanation of exactly what's going on. So this is speculative, I admit, but very important. Over to you, Carmen.
Yes, even though there had been rumors that Dave Weldon might be pulled as nominee for the CDC, it was still surprising this morning that this happened just a few hours before he was due to appear in the Senate for his confirmation hearing. I think we will probably find out more in the next few hours from the White House exactly why they did that. I am still not very sure that they will be, explaining really the full reasoning of what stood behind this. But you may be right. They may be seeking a balance in the people who lead the US top health institutions and their views on vaccines. Obviously, the health secretary, Robert Kennedy Jr., is very well known for his vaccine skepticism, according to some, or outright anti-vax activism. You have had other people that have raised concerns about the links between vaccines and diseases like autism. The CDC is a very important institution in recommending vaccines for children and for adults against really important infectious diseases. So they may be looking at having maybe someone there who has potentially a different view on vaccine efficacy than the health secretary and other people in the administration.
What will you be looking for now in terms of explanation?
Just to see whether his statements on vaccines and his skepticism of vaccines is the reason why the White House pulled him. We will see whether the White House outlines it as such, because they have in the past sort of like batted down assessments or statements that Robert Kennedy Jr. was an anti-vaxxer. So they might not be fully forthcoming about why exactly they did it. But it would be interesting to see how they explain it. And also, I would say, even more importantly, who the new nominee will be. Many people like to say that in the Trump administration, people are policy. So it's important to see who the new nominee is and the views of that person regarding vaccines and other really important public health issues as, the potential head of the CDC.
Now, as we headed into the Trump administration, many people have commented that CDC is especially vulnerable as an institution, that there's been calls within Congress, particularly among House Republicans, about separating out the safety and review of vaccines from CDC. This is something that Weldon had proposed. It's still an active idea. There's a sense of retribution against the institution. And there's morale issues. There's been some dismissals, but you haven't seen a lot of mass resignations. But it's a pretty sensitive moment in CDC history right now to have this all happen. And then we're back to the moment of, well, who's going to lead it? And how soon are we going to get leadership in place in order to stabilize things and be able to correct course?
Yes. In some ways, the CDC has been targeted so much in the past, and particularly during the pandemic, for some of the mishaps that they had and some of the changing guidelines, for example, with wearing masks. We all remember that. But I would say what was surprising to me was it didn't seem to be at the top of the sort of like target list for the administration as maybe some other agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development, which I've also covered closely, was, and which wasn't initially targeted so much. So I think it's important to see what's going to happen. I don't think CDC is totally out of the woods. Obviously, the administration is still seeking to lay off people across the government en masse. So I think we will probably still see a lot of people at the CDC let go. And so far, not having a confirmed person to lead the agencies hasn't stopped the administration from laying people off, right? They've done that at the FDA, at the NIH, a little bit at the CDC. So I think we probably are still to see some of those mass layoffs and to see what part of the CDC they're going to affect the most.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at what's been happening in Gaines County, Texas, and in neighboring Lee County across the border in New Mexico, the CDC dispatched a little over 1 week ago, small team, 6 or 7 folks, at the request of the Texas authorities. Texas Health Commissioner requested CDC to come in, and they sent in these team members to help correct the market shortages in the MMR vaccine, to help strengthen infection control within the hospitals in Texas, and I would hope in New Mexico, where pregnant women are showing up infected with measles into these hospitals. There's a great risk of spread in the hospital setting, so they focused on that. And I think they focused on the whole question around outreach and communications to the Mennonite leadership and to others here. In previous outbreaks, for instance, the Orthodox Jewish population in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and in Westchester County, in 2019, there were 1,274 cases. It lasted a full year. The Secretary of HHS, Alex Azar, were very vocal in calling for and quietly and publicly engaging with the leadership of that community to try to persuade them to isolate when sick and to take up the vaccines and to get their sick children to the hospital as quickly as possible and not hold back. We haven't had that pattern in Texas. We haven't had our secretary coming out with an unvarnished, unequivocal statement saying, get your kids vaccinated now, get them in early and don't delay and isolate. That's been missing. And I expect that CDC is paying a price. It took CDC 30 days from the early signs of this outbreak to issue any announcement on that. That was something that's drawn a lot of criticism.
Yes. I mean, obviously the times have changed. It was now during this outbreak, we have the new administration that has just taken over. We already talked about the views of the health secretary regarding measles. In the first cabinet meeting, I would say a couple of weeks ago, he initially appeared to dismiss the seriousness of this outbreak.
Not unusual, he characterized it.
Exactly, saying that outbreaks happen all the time. Obviously, as this has grown and we have started seeing deaths, the situation is a lot more serious now. I think just in terms of isolation and vaccines, another important context that we need to keep in mind is what happened during the pandemic. We have seen in many cases people being told to isolate, and we had the lockdowns during the pandemic. I think many people are very adverse to that now. Everyone has sort of like bad memories of being stuck in the house. Many people understand why they need to do that, but I think it's a lot harder to advise that now when people went through this sort of like collective trauma in some cases of being stuck at home or not being able to go about their daily lives. And obviously in some cases, vaccine mandates backfired. People don't want to get vaccinated now. They don't want the government to tell them what to do. So I would expect that that has also played a role in maybe the CDC trying to be more cautious about how they communicate about this without triggering sort of like memories of the COVID-19 pandemic and any sort of like bad reaction that people have had over the last few years.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. I mean, when you look at this decision to pull Weldon at the 11th hour, a dramatic decision, you could argue, okay, this is showing us the force, the impact of the measles outbreak that's burgeoning and the anxiety that's causing in the White House and elsewhere. But you could step another step back and say that's occurring in a context in which post-COVID, the hesitancy and reluctance to take up vaccines has deepened and worsened across the nation, and that childhood vaccine uptake has dropped from 95 to 93%. As a national level, that's a dangerous drop, but there are many, many places in the United States where it's dropped significantly, where you're going to have these clusters, large clusters of populations, where if it turns out that there's a transmission of active measles virus into that environment, you're going to see those lit up pretty rapidly, and you're going to see a geographic explosion. And awareness of that must be weighing on the White House at this point as they look at this and think, okay, we cannot afford this.
The one thing about the Trump White House that I learned in covering some of its action over the past almost 2 months is that sometimes there are also things that we cannot think about that might be behind the scenes motivating things. So I also wondered if there's something else that we're ignoring that we're just not aware of that may have triggered this. I think your analysis is spot on. And I think it could signal a shift in what the White House is doing facing this outbreak in Texas and some of the neighboring states. But I also always try to keep in the back of my mind there might be something else that we just don't know, we don't expect. You know, I feel like we've been surprised very often by the Trump administration's actions in the last 6 to 8 weeks. So I don't know if that's going to be part of that surprise or if it's really just fits in the broader context that you described earlier.
Yes.
The other thing that I do wonder with the outbreak of measles and other outbreaks, a lot of the time when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, the reason why parents hesitate to vaccinate their children is because they don't see the disease around anymore. So they don't perceive the risk. They don't think that their kids are going to get sick because they don't see that happening. So one thing I do wonder in this case is if this outbreak is going to start triggering more parents deciding to vaccinate their children because they see it, at least they see it on the news if they're not right there where this is happening. I live very close to the Dallas airport, and there was a case of measles that passed through the airport recently. And I have seen the moms groups on Facebook in the area really lit up with questions about measles vaccine as soon as that was reported. Everyone was sort of like concerned that maybe their child could have been exposed. So I don't have the answer whether this will have more people getting their kids vaccinated, but I always wonder if seeing the disease actually leads to that.
I think that's a terribly important point. I think we need to keep reminding ourselves, and I'm sure this is very much on the minds of the White House, that when you get an outbreak of measles, you can expect 20% of the children are going to be hospitalized. You can expect that one person will die for every 1,000 roughly that are infected. You can expect that in situations like we see in Texas and New Mexico, there's a gross undercount of cases because of the infrastructure limitations and the resistance to coming forward. And you can expect cases of deafness, of blindness, of intellectual impairment, of immune amnesia, the wipeout of protections against other diseases acquired through vaccination. All of those conditions are part of this outbreak so that becomes very real very fast. Let's shift and talk about USAID. One of the reasons I was reaching out to you, Carmen, is you've been covering the story as it's unfolded over the weeks in terms of the assault, the special and focused assault upon USAID post-inauguration, with Musk playing a lead role, with Peter Marocco appointed into the State Department AID as a sort of key point person, and the sort of remarkably radical and swift action taken to decimate USAID. Tell us a little bit about that overall process. What did you observe? I wanted to have you come on because you've been close in watching this happen. You've been talking to folks at AID. You've been talking to folks who are contractors and implementers, those in HIV, those in malaria, maternal health, emergency health services. All of those areas were ones that are hypersensitive. There were claims there would be exceptions and waivers for those. Those didn't always happen. There were court cases that tried to slow things or call them to a halt, but those oftentimes didn't necessarily stop the flow of events. Give us your reflections on what happened.
It's been really astonishing to watch, and especially to keep up with the pace of how fast this agency was dismantled. First, I think very few expected that the U.S. Agency for International Development would be targeted to the point of being completely shuttered, and now whatever is left of it folded into the State Department. And we have to be fair and say that the idea of having the agency folded into the State Department has been floating around for a long time. But this went just way beyond that. The majority of people, and we're talking about upwards of 10,000 people, were either laid off, put on administrative leave. In some cases, some of them were shut out of their work emails and any other IT systems they were operating as part of their jobs. I remember one day talking to someone who had just returned from a humanitarian area. I'm not going to say the area because I definitely don't want that person to be identified. They really stressed that to me. And the person couldn't access anything on their computer, on their work computer. The only access to emails they had was on their phone, but they couldn't really work. So things that you do not expect to see from a government like the US government have happened. Obviously, the expose by Elon Musk has become iconic, feeding USAID into the wood chipper. And that happened very, very fast. People at Doge took over the systems, shut down payments. And what we have seen is a very quick dismantling of the agency, but also of all the ecosystem that existed around the agency, most of the foreign aid ecosystem. We've seen thousands of people laid off, projects stopped. And in the early days of what was the initial freeze of foreign aid, Secretary Marco Rubio and others said, oh, we've given waivers to life-saving programs like HIV treatment and care and malaria and others. But what became quickly apparent is that the organizations that were running those projects weren't getting paid. So even if you're allowed to continue that, if you didn't get any money and if you didn't get the money for work that you had already done, they soon ran out of cash flow and effectively they couldn't really do it anymore. I think that has been one of the main issues, sort of like underlying this. On one side, this waiver existed on paper, but it almost never existed in reality because there was no cash flow. And we're sitting here about 2 months later, and in many cases, there's still no cash flow for many of these organizations, even for projects that they, or for work that they did before the current administration took over. Many are still facing bankruptcy and have laid out most of their staff. Obviously, there have been many court cases. In some cases, people who were laid off at USAID sued or private contractors sued. And it's also been tough to watch everything. Fortunately, we have a legal team that has been brilliant at covering that and explaining to me what this means. But as you said, in some cases, it slowed down the process, but it still allowed it to continue. Like we had a judge, a federal judge, who had initially frozen the dismantling of the agency, firing people, and then he allowed it to proceed. We have had in another case, another federal judge saying to the State Department and to Pete Morocco, you have to pay the bills for work that was done until early February. And the administration really stonewalled and has not allowed many of those payments to proceed. I think they're starting now, but just trickling from what it used to be thousands of payments in a day before the current administration took over to now really them saying those payments have to be manually checked. We have to make sure there's no waste, fraud, and abuse. And that basically means that it's a super slow process. It could take days, weeks. And in the meantime, there's organizations that are relying on that money are laying people off and, ready to file for bankruptcy.
One question, one mega question I want you to reflect on is, how is this possible? How is it possible that you could have this extraordinarily swift annihilation of an agency created in 1961 that has become a fixture of U.S. foreign policy? It has had its problems ever since its creation. There's been calls for reform and debates over its value and merit. It suffered a near terminal experience after the Vietnam War because it was bent very much to the purposes of Vietnam. It barely survived and revitalized. So it's had near-death experiences in its history. But how is this possible that this could happen?
I think no one would say that this was possible before this happened. It reminds me of one of the things, like everyone says it's impossible until it happens. And this is what we're witnessing right now. I think a few factors contributed to this happening. You had a Congress that was very inactive. Everyone said this is a congressionally authorized agency with congressionally authorized funding, and the executive branch cannot dismantling overnight, which is basically what they have done. But besides statements, and particularly from Republicans who obviously control both the House and the Senate, you haven't seen so much action. Many of them have just really rallied behind the Trump administration and Elon Musk's effort. They have, repeated some of the claims that the agency was funding really sort of like, far left causes, very progressive, pro LGBTQ and pro transgender causes. But they never really responded to questions like whether, based just on that, and some of the facts about that have also been disputed, but based on that, if it's worth dismantling the whole agency. This was done also very, very fast. So it took a while for the court cases to catch up. And I think by the time some of them did, even though they haven't sort of like led to any major reprieve, a lot of the damage had been done. A lot of the programs have been shut down because the money weren't flowing. So I think the Trump administration really showed how this was possible, just moving fast, not having a serious opposition in Congress, particularly from your own party, to this, and letting the courts catch up, but very slowly, and in some cases really partially giving reprieve. So I think we are witnessing a whole new world into how things could be done in government.
Yeah. The Trump administration benefited from the surprise factor, right? Anybody who read the Project 2025 or the America First Policy Institute statements and the like, none of this was in there. This grew out of the partnership with Musk and Doge and the White House. It was a late arrival in terms of this kind of plan to do a shock and awe, swift annihilation of an agency that the judgment being the political support within the American public was going to be weak. Yes, there's a constituency, but it's not that important. NGOs were crying foul. It didn't have much impact. And if you moved fast and furious, you could get big results because you're catching people by surprise. None of us thought this was going to happen.
Exactly, yes. And one of the things that has come up a lot in this debate was about the lack of a constituency, right? When the Trump administration tried to freeze domestic funding, there was a lawsuit, I think, happening within hours, and a judge froze that within hours. When they tried to cap the indirect cost of the National Institutes of Health, you saw something similar happening. With foreign aid, the lawsuits were not filed until weeks later. And I will always remember this one briefing that we had, a bunch of reporters had with senior executives at some of the organizations that were benefiting from foreign aid. They were implementers of the US foreign aid. None of them wanted to speak on the record. These were top executives that definitely had that authority if they wanted to. They didn't want to speak on the record. And I remember asking, why is no one suing? This was probably in the immediate 2 weeks after the freeze. And someone said, who will be the person or the organization to put their hands up and then be the target of the Trump administration, be the target of Elon Musk? We do not want to do that. It eventually happened, but the initial reaction was of paralysis and fear. And I had never experienced fear among a sector in my reporting like I've seen in those first few weeks of the foreign aid freeze. And then obviously most of it was terminated. And definitely the administration banked on the fact that it will be hard to lobby for sending money abroad. Many were saying, why don't we send money to take care of people's health issues abroad, but we have major health issues in the United States. Why don't we give those money to our own people? And I think that's really hard at times to argue with, even though you say, look, we keep diseases abroad from spreading here to the United States. That still feels to many people as a sort of like faraway concept. Very often when I would write a story saying, global health will be decimated, for example, by the foreign aid cuts, the reaction that I would get to the story on platforms like X would be like, why don't you write about that money should have been spent in the United States? People here cannot afford prescription medication. Why should we care about, people abroad? They have their own governments. They have their own taxpayers' money. They should use that for their own citizens. So I think that contributed a lot to the fact that the agency and the whole foreign aid ecosystem and funding could be frozen and then shut down so fast.
Yeah. So what's going to be left? Let's focus on two questions. One is, what will be left of AID, do you think? And secondly, what's the broader future for global health and U.S. leadership in global health?
So I think we still do not know what is left of USAID. I have requested from the State Department a list of the terminations that they have sent. So the list of all the contracts and grants that they have terminated and a list of those that they have kept. My colleagues obtained one, but it's not the official one that the State Department has. And they haven't sent one. Then you saw sort of like slightly different accounts about how much was cut. In core documents, the administration was saying they have cut about 92% of programs at USAID. Then we saw Secretary of State Rubio recently saying that they cut about 83% of programs. So it's unclear whether they decided that out of the 92 they initially cut, they're going to still keep maybe a few percentages. And the final one they landed on was 83%. This uncertainty and unclarity has really been defining of how the administration has acted on this. I was at the door of two meetings that Pete Morocco had with members of the House and members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week. And the members of Congress who were in that room also said that they asked for lists and they weren't given one. So first, I think we still don't fully know. We don't have clarity of what is left. I think it will probably take a while to have that publicly available. And then in some cases, people on the ground are confused about what they can and cannot do. Some organizations were told they can continue with their projects. Then they were told that they were terminated. And in some cases, they were told, oh, that termination was actually sent in error. You can continue. So obviously, if you're the executive of one of those organizations, you're afraid to proceed because you are not sure you can actually do that. So that's the one thing. We still don't know as of today what is left. I think the second broader picture is that we have witnessed a seismic shift in global health and foreign aid. Many of the people that I speak to say things will never be the same, but it's also a shock, right? And new things arise from shocks and from crises. And I think what I'm looking out for now is how whatever is left in the United States, but also globally, will be reorganized, how it will be made more efficient, and sort of like what issues will it choose to tackle from the so many issues that the world is facing, right? From humanitarian crisis to health crisis and conflict and unstable societies.
Thank you. You've also been paying attention to what's happened with WHO. Now, very early executive order issued right after inauguration, announcing, not a big surprise, announcing that the US was going to withdraw membership from WHO. And this was a sort of a return to the position taken in the middle of 2020 by the Trump administration. It was not a big surprise.
Yes.
The door is still open for the possibility of a negotiation over reforms that might lead, if it were successful, to a continued US role in membership. The withdrawal had devastating impacts on WHO budgetarily in terms of planning for the future, and the withdrawal of 30 US experts who were on detail to Geneva from different agencies, mostly from CDC. What's been the implications, the downstream implications for this decision, Carmen?
So we've obviously seen the WHO sort of like tighten up, cut some costs. And recently there was reporting from a former colleague of mine, Ashley Furlong, saying that the WHO is actually offering people early retirement to further scale down the number of people it has on payroll. Beyond the immediate impact on the WHO, we have actually seen almost a trend with other countries following suit. Argentina has said they're withdrawing from the WHO. Obviously, we know that the president there, Javier Milei, is very much aligned in terms of ideology with the current US administration. We have seen debates in Israel about withdrawing because they felt that at times the WHO has been very critical or borderline anti-Semitic by their criticism of Israel's conduct in the conflict in Gaza against Hamas. We have seen right-wing politicians in some European countries, like in Italy and in Hungary and in Germany, saying we should be doing the same, withdraw from the WHO. There's a group in the UK led by Nigel Farage, who's the famous Brexiteer campaigner, that is also looking at whether WHO should be reformed and how, and if there should be a whole new World Health Organization built up. So it does feel like there's a stream of things happening that are, against the WHO or highly questioning the WHO's effectiveness and structure and mission. And that might have stronger implications for the agency. Obviously, some of the countries that have considered or said they're withdrawing, they don't have the same financial power and impact on the WHO like the US withdrawal has. But, if you have more and more countries, questioning the WHO and criticizing it, it might put the future of the organization at risk. I mean, what would it be like to have two WHOs, one for certain like ideologies and one for the other one? So we might see further shift on that, and there might be more peril ahead for the World Health Organization, I think.
Thank you very much. One last topic. You've talked a bit about AI. The Biden administration put in place executive orders and policy papers that followed from that around trying to put guardrails in place to both encourage the development of AI, but also to guard against dangers and risks. What has the Trump administration approach been, and how does this relate to health, and particularly global health?
They have obviously teared up the Biden administration's executive order on AI. And based on the speeches, for example, of Vice President J.D. Vance at the AI conference in Paris about a month ago, it looks like they're really sort of like following a similar approach to other industries where they're looking for deregulation. They do not want so many rules in place that would really hamper the development of artificial intelligence. I think the administration clearly recognizes that this is sort of like the next big technology, and they do want the United States to be the leader in that, as it has been in other technological areas. It's still a good question, what does this mean for health? Because obviously, as we know, artificial intelligence models used in health could harm people if they're not properly calibrated to deal with the health issues that they're being used for, if the data is not relevant for the populations that the AI is used to. I think the jury is still out to see what is happening. Obviously, the FDA has a role in approving AI models that are used in health, and that's still continuing. But we still have to see whether we will see a lot of development of AI models that are then used for health purposes in different ways that maybe don't have the right guardrails in place, or if we have gotten to a point where obviously companies producing these models understand that for their reputation to be intact and for them to be able to thrive in this industry, they have to make sure that the models are appropriate and safe for delivering what they promise to deliver.
I thought it was interesting that Marty Makary, in his confirmation hearing on his nomination to head up FDA, that he spoke about AI as it's going to become an active element in reviewing the safety and efficacy of medications and medical products. It's going to be used by both payers and providers. That's inevitable. It's going to be monitoring downstream compliance with commitments made by the developers of different technologies about whether they really do comply on safety. They're not going to totally displace humans, but they're going to play more of a role in both whether our claims for reimbursement are approved or denied, but also whether the real safety and compliance is monitored effectively. So I could see the wheels turning in his mind that this is something that's going to have to pay a lot of attention to.
Yes. And what AI is typically very good at is sifting through so much data. And for example, when you look at data from clinical trials to approve a new drug or, medical device, obviously you deal with a lot of data. So AI is really good at sort of like looking at that and probably, like placing different categories for, like there could be safety signals or there could be things like that. Obviously, a lot of the things that AI experts have stressed is that you always have to have a human sort of like making the final decision. And I think that's going to remain crucial, particularly when it comes to, for example, reimbursement requests. We have seen the backlash that the health insurance industry has seen in the United States, particularly with the murder last year of United Healthcare CEO. So at least in that, it does look like the health insurance companies are paying more attention to rejections, and they want to make sure that their system is still supervised by a person so they can justify rejections given the backlash. But we will definitely continue to see AI being used a lot more in the healthcare industry to really sift through data and sort of like give insights to researchers or to different people, providers, about things that data is showing.
Yeah. Carmen, we've gotten to the end of our hour here. This has been a great conversation. We try to close with each of our guests by asking what gives you the greatest hope and optimism in this moment. A very confused moment, one fraught with lots of anxiety and uncertainty and fear. But what gives you hope in this moment?
Yes, there's a lot of change, and it's very fast change. So that could be very overwhelming and confusing and inducing anxiety. But in talking to people who have worked in areas that are now being dismantled, like foreign aid or global health, or just with people who work in the different parts of the government, for example, at HHS, who are not sure they're going to have a job the next day. I've seen them sort of like really rise up and sort of like take each day at a time and decide what they're going to do with their skills and the rest of their lives. So what gives me hope is that I think good things will still come out of that. Obviously, it's a process of reorganization and it's painful for a lot of people, but I think we will still see new things, good things, potentially better things coming out of some of this turmoil that we're all experiencing right now.
Thank you so much. You've been very generous. Really appreciate having you come on again. Thank you,
Thank
Carmen.
you so much for having me. It's always great to be here and to be talking to you.
Thank you for listening to The Common Health. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a follow and leave a review. To learn more about the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security or listen to other CSIS podcasts, please visit csis.org.